The philosopher Voltaire famously observed, "To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize." In Voltaire's day, it was dangerous to criticize the Catholic Church and its dogmas. In our era, it is dangerous to criticize the Church of gender identity and its dogmas. Gender fluidity is a very church-like dogma in that it is based entirely on faith. When you consider the other grounds for discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act, race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, genetic characteristics, and so forth, you'll see that every other ground for discrimination is certifiable with objective evidence. Only gender identity is based entirely in subjective feeling. Bill C-16 compels us to act as though the notion that sex and gender are entirely separate phenomena were settled science rather than what Dr. Deborah has just explained that it is, a recently conceived theory unsupported by databases sufficiently large for true scientific evaluation. Classic liberalism concerned itself with the dignity of the individual. Progressivism is concerned with people's feelings. Dignity, a human estate whose criteria reflect extensive philosophical and legal precedents, cutting across all race, class, and gender lines, is a rational basis for a rights discussion. Judgments based on feelings rely completely on the good faith and rational interpretive powers of the complainant. Much of the Me Too movement is based entirely in feelings of what is or is not appropriate speech, tone, gesture, or intention. The statement, "I felt uncomfortable," spoken by a woman, holds great social power, sometimes leading to failures of due process that ruin innocent people's lives. In elevating feelings as the arbiter of a human right, Bill C-16 privileges individual comfort over individual rights, which makes it not only a bad law, but a dangerous law. In an illuminating 2011 academic paper, John F. Furedy, now deceased, then a retired professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, likened institutions and governments that privilege individual comfort over individual rights to totalitarian regimes. He wrote, "The most striking feature of totalitarian societies is that the comfort criterion takes precedent over considerations of truth in general and fairness to individuals in particular." Furedy coined a phrase for this tendency, velvet totalitarianism. He describes 5 common elements that apply to any form of totalitarianism, hard or soft. 1, the presence of uninterpretable laws. There is no objective metric for defining the alleged offense. 2, the presence and power of unqualified pseudo-experts like commissars in the Soviet Union and equity officers in universities, often who have no academic accreditation or even a higher education degree, and yet who pontificate on matters such as the nature of the curriculum or what faculty should be hired. 3rd, status-defined ethics. In a totalitarian society, imprisonment or torture is permitted if the victim is a crypto-capitalist or a Zionist conspirator. In a velvet totalitarian state, white heterosexuals or Christians are permissible targets for accusations of racism or transphobia. Furedy would have appreciated the phrase, "white girl tears," a locution of contempt applied to Lindsay Shepherd. 4th is a fear of engaging in public discussion of controversial but fundamental issues, on which I will elaborate. And finally, 5th, a demonization of those perceived as political or ideological dissidents. Most journalists are liberals and respect the official dogmas of the Church of Gender Identity. Even journalists known for their objectivity tend to treat the Church's high priests with kid gloves. It's not always glaringly obvious, but it's there. In the segment of TVO's The Agenda on trans pronoun usage, made famous via the Lindsay Shepherd affair, for example, the focus has been on Jordan Peterson's resistance to invented words. But I was equally struck by panelist Nicholas Matt, a transgender academic, claiming that studies had proved that sex and gender were completely unlinked. At this whopper of an untruth, host Steve Paikin did not raise a challenging or even a curious eyebrow. Paikin should have politely asked, "Really? Can you be specific?" He pulled his punches because transphobia. For another example, in December 2017, the CBC made the decision to pull a scheduled BBC documentary, Trans Kids, Who Knows Best, from its lineup after complaints came in that it spread misinformation. It wasn't misinformation the protesters objected to, it was information. This was not a documentary made by a few Ryerson journalism students for course credits. It was made by the freaking BBC, presumably the ne plus ultra of reliable, credible, and even politically correct journalism. If the BBC cannot be trusted on this issue, who can? So, effectively, the CBC conceded that it is ruled, on this subject anyway, by special interest activists. Now, unlike Indigenous correctness, with its unified narrative of uninterrupted victimhood, LGBT has become increasingly divided internally, and this can be confusing for media people. The turf wars, kind of a pun because TURF and TERF, between feminists and trans activists is fierce, hate-filled, and sometimes even physically violent. The liberal media want to be trans-friendly, but they also want to be feminist-friendly. It's a tough call sometimes when radical feminists are accusing male-to-female trans activists of being misogynists in drag and battling for ownership of the word woman. I would not normally side with radical feminists, but on this issue, I have a few readers here. But on this issue, they are in the right. If a woman is defined as anyone who identifies as a woman, then trans women have the right to be rape counselors, an intolerable intrusion into what should be a safe space for rape survivors. In Alice Through the Looking Glass, Lewis Carroll was prescient on the trans movement's co-optation of words and their definition. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said, in rather a scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master? That's all. So pronouns were never the real issue. There are Humpty Dumptys in every movement, and of movements, there is no end. I developed a pretty thick skin early in my journalism career dealing with the pit bull advocacy movement, whose zealotry, they often equate pit bulls literally with Anne Frank, equals and often surpasses that of social justice, race, and gender warriors. Researching and writing about canine politics also taught me that data, statistics, epidemiology, and peer-reviewed research do not interest many journalists half so much as mantras, myths, bogus studies, and downloaded narratives, a fact that is evident every time, for example, Jordan Peterson is interviewed by a feminist media host. Canadian journalists have more to fear from offended Indigenous activists than from offended trans activists. Where the church of gender identity is built on the shifting sand of unsustainable theories and will likely, hopefully, collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, the church of colonial oppression is built on the solid rock of actual history and national guilt. I have written several critical columns on trans activists' unseemly aggression, but so far, the only punishment I have suffered is vilification on Twitter and one lawyer's letter to the postmillennial.com, where I also have a weekly column, meant to intimidate but without teeth and ignored. On the other hand, I was fired from a fun gig with CBC Radio, a regular spot on their news trivia comedy show, Because News, for indigenously incorrect remarks I had made on another network. I wasn't told which one it was. It might have been my statement that the residential schools were based in good intentions. But don't pity me for being fired, because being fired from a CBC radio show is only a disappointment. Well, it is a disappointment, but only. Unlike young journalists with their livelihood and career goals in the balance, my mortgage is paid and all my ambitions have been fulfilled. Following the famous Cultural Appropriation Prize debacle, posited in the spirit of satire by Hal Niedzwiecki, editor of Right magazine, many journalists paid a stiff price for joining in what they perceived was a parodic concept. Some, including Niedzwiecki, were fired or felt forced to resign, as my son Jonathan Kay did from the Walrus magazine. Steve Latorante, managing editor of CBC's The National, was reassigned rather than fired, but as part of his punishment had to sit within a circle of his co-workers in perfect Maoist re-education style and apologize to each one in turn. I am told some of the women cried. All this for the crime of attempting to apply humor to politically correct absurdities. There is an Arabic word, ketman, the position taken by those who desire to be, quote, at one with others in order not to be alone. The word arises in a 1953 book, a series of essays by the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz called The Captive Mind, about what happens to the inner lives of intellectuals living under totalitarianism. When Stalin's Iron Curtain fell over Poland after World War II, intellectuals had to adapt very quickly. They were called upon not only to obey the regime, but to proselytize on its behalf. Because it was too painful to imagine they were parroting lies, Miłosz's fellow Polish intellectuals insisted they were speaking words they believed. They were not lying. Ketman goes deeper than lying. It is a kind of performance engaged in to survive the sensation of living with a divided mind. Those practicing ketman are actors. Everything they say is part of a performance. You can feel the performative effect of most spoken and written commentary every time you turn to a progressively disposed newspaper, website, or TV show. Privately, many media people complain about having to defend what they know to be objectively indefensible. But to maintain their status as woke and enlightened, according to criteria set by ideologues and monitored by Twitter mobs, they will say things they do not believe, but have convinced themselves are necessary to say to advance that laudable goal, social justice, always on the horizon, never arising, because its utopian goalposts never stop receding. There is an old Jewish joke that applies here. In the era of the Russian pogroms, two Jews are walking home from synagogue when they are accosted by hooligans. They flee, the hooligans in pursuit. As they run, one Jew says to the other, "Why are we running? There are only two of them, and there are two of us." His friend replies, "Yes, but they are together, and we are alone." To be alone in an age of ideological tyranny is not a question of numbers. It is a question of who has the power, who is together, and who is impotent or near impotent to fight back. This event, as Serena said, was scheduled to take place at a downtown YMCA. One activist's opposition was enough for us to be deplatformed. One, and I've been there before. Cancellation of events with this and similarly politically incorrect topics occur routinely all over the country. We are lucky to be here, but we should not have had to be lucky. In the US, 62% of students who identify as left-leaning agree that silencing speech through protest is acceptable. And 1 in 5 college students believe it is acceptable to use violence to stop speech with which they disagree. These are chilling numbers that demonstrate the uphill battle we are fighting. But even though we are alone and they are together, we must not flee. Unlike the Jews in Russia, it is not our lives that are at stake, only our self-respect. As the brilliant journalist Charles Krauthammer, who died just weeks ago, once said, "You're betraying your whole life if you don't say what you think and you don't say it honestly and bluntly." Thank you.